This is Joseph Hoffman at the Center for Inquiry. I'm pleased to be speaking today to Professor Laura Purdy, who is the Alan McCulloch Distinguished Visiting Professor at Hamilton College and the Koch Professor of Humanities at Wells College. We're going to be discussing with Professor Purdy today the implications of the philosophy called philosophical naturalism. Laura, could I just begin by asking you to give us a very, very brief definition of philosophical naturalism?
And evidence for our beliefs that supernatural claims for which evidence is either unavailable or doesn't make sense, the demand for it doesn't make sense, is just not in the realm of attention.
So we can rule certain kinds of things out of court in terms of really knowing anything about them. And philosophical naturalism as a way of thinking about the world helps us to do that. Would that be a fair assessment of what this school of philosophy particularly helps us with?
Yeah, I would say that. It doesn't mean that things aren't going on, but since we could never know about them, what's to be said?
Okay. To what extent? I mean, because philosophical naturalists seem to come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and some people say that they're philosophical naturalists except, or scientific naturalists up to a point, but. And I'm just wondering if this is the kind of philosophy that you embrace, a lock, stock, and barrel, or whether there are aspects of it that sort of fall short of providing an adequate way of thinking about the world or dealing with the world or making moral decisions, for example.
I don't think so. My area of specialization is ethics, and for better or for worse, mostly for worse, people who come from religious traditions seem to believe that they have a lockhold on ethical discussion. And unfortunately, much of the public seems to believe that, being completely unaware, apparently, that philosophers do this. And I think we do much better ethics because we're not drawing on assumptions that are unfounded or can't be justified. So we wind up focusing on human welfare. I mean, there are a variety of ways of expressing similar ideas. Of course, there are differences in how they play out depending on which assumptions or which values you choose. But at least we don't have to worry about pleasing some magical entity whose desires can't really be known and have to be interpreted through self-proclaimed experts, and who often recommend systems of belief and action that lead to total misery.
So some god that we don't know much about, or the flying spaghetti monsters, those would be convertible terms for you, because we can't know very much about either one.
Or anything.
Or anything of that sort.
Contrary to the claim, I mean, it seems to me if you have high epistemological standards, then you wind up concluding that we really can't say anything about them.
I like to think of you as a trained philosopher, and I tend to think of myself as an untrained philosopher. So let an untrained philosopher ask you this question. I mean, if you look at what's happening, for example, in the field of psychotherapy these days, most therapists feel pretty free to pick and choose among a variety of treatments, a variety of therapies, and they've been trained in several. And a lot of this has to do with the needs of the patient. So I'm sort of wondering, because you have to teach a broad range of philosophical traditions and approaches, where does the approach we're calling philosophical naturalism fit in? I mean, is it the, and this may be a bad analogy, and feel free to say so if it is, but does philosophical naturalism, in a sense, rule out other approaches? What does it have to do with metaphysics? Is there room for the teaching of metaphysics? Is philosophical naturalism a kind of endpoint in the history of philosophy? Where do you rank it? I know that's a very long question, but...
yeah, also numerous sub-questions.
Yeah.
I personally try and stay as far away from metaphysics as I can. And I certainly don't give anything like equal time. In fact, until recently, I gave no time to religious perspectives, since I'm mostly thinking about ethics, teaching ethics, and ethics-related subjects. I have become forced to, in a way, because of, I would say, the increasing religiosity of our students. Although here's an interesting distinction between the students I've been encountering at Wells and the ones I'm encountering now at Hamilton, who also happen to be philosophy majors. They're still back in the bubble that I was in, whereas many of the students at Wells, I mean, it simply has to be addressed, but I mean, despite the fact that we're spending a lot of time in this conference talking about naturalism and its problems, basically it seems to me it can be disposed of, at least in the context of anything like applied ethics, pretty quickly.
Right.
I mean, if I were teaching philosophy of religion, that would be a different story, but I'm not doing that. So.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have from time to time, and this comes up frequently, including a number of theologians, and some of my best ex-friends are theologians. And I'm just wondering, there are theologians out there who feel that they are following an essentially sort of naturalistic path in their theology. A lot of this has to do with the way they write about God or think about God or invent various circumlocutions for God. I think this goes way back to the 19th century and ideas that God is a kind of moral impulse or something of that sort. Do you find those philosophically dishonest positions? Do you think that we can do without that kind of language? And would you say that a theologian who was sitting here, and I don't think that I am one, but if a theologian were sitting here and saying to you that I accept the naturalistic worldview every bit as much as you do, what would be your response to that theologian?
Well, far be it from me to say whether people are being dishonest or not, except insofar as they say contradictory things, which could be explained other ways. In a way, you know, that part isn't what interests me centrally, but rather the implications they draw from that. If they accept a purely naturalistic ethics, and they have, you know, they're sort of deists, I can live with that. Although part of me as a philosopher can't, because I've been a big fan of Clifford, who does argue that if you believe things, you should have evidence for them. And of course, then you soon get into discussions of, well, what counts as good evidence? And that's not really particularly what interests me. Intellectually, I'm much more interested in, well, what counts as good evidence for ethical claims and ethical recommendations. And if they're prepared to have purely naturalistic ethics, and for example, unlike some of the writers I was looking at last night, yes, they're prepared to go pretty far down that road, but when push comes to shove, it turns out that they find it very hard to let go of assumptions that mean that they're actually trying to justify things that seem to me to be unjustifiable.
Okay, so naturalism plays some role in the way you do ethics, but you said that you're not particularly interested, or perhaps I'm misstating the case, not particularly interested in assessing the evidence. I mean, what in the naturalistic framework counts as good evidence? Is it always physical evidence? Is it always evidence derived from experience of the physical world? Is that what we have to deal with, and that's all we're sort of permitted to deal with as we try to understand this philosophy?
Well, I guess the things that I look at are just the really simple things. One, does it hang together logically? And obviously you can have multiple consistent worldviews that have no connection with reality. So that kind of, whatever system you work out does need to have some connection with reality, which is provided by facts about the world. Do they have to be physical? Well, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. Is it a good place to finish? I guess that's what some ethicists would want to know. I mean, are there other considerations depending on the kind of ethics you're doing? I mean, if you're a consequentialist, for example, you have things to weigh that aren't purely physical in decisions like that.
Well, you have to weigh people's desires, their emotions.
Yeah.
But
those are real things too.
But again, what really interests me is, and being a consequentialist, obviously that rules out a lot of things. Where do you go when you're looking for, frankly, your ultimate values? And what seems critically important to me is that they be grounded in human needs, desires, welfare.
Informed common
so what
sense.
more do you need than that?
Now, I'm changing gears slightly, but we lost the philosopher Richard Rorty not long ago. And as with, philosophers, like all people, are permitted to change their mind, and we can trace this for good or bad in the lives of many philosophers. Richard Rorty has been labeled, and I'm not sure how well this label sticks, as being a postmodernist, or at least sympathetic to elements of postmodern philosophy. And many philosophers would say that philosophical naturalism really butts heads with postmodernist philosophy, or postmodernism in general, as a way of sort of looking at the world, or looking at texts, looking at reality. What's your view of that? And is there any possibility of a kind of reconciliation between postmodernism and the naturalistic worldview?
I'm not really an expert on this, but insofar as I have looked into it, it strikes me that to the extent that postmodernism constitutes a kind of relativism, it seems to me it is inconsistent with any attempt to make sense of the world that does assume that there are regularities and that there are states of affairs which are represented by claims about facts. And so far, being a pragmatist here, that perspective has worked out pretty well. So it seems to me that to that extent, these are incompatible views. And it's not clear to me where postmodernism really gets you.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if the problem you would confront as a philosopher is the accusation, at least, that postmodernism regards truth and even facts sometimes as negotiable things, whereas in a naturalistic point of view, they're quite concrete. I mean, as you say, they're the starting point. They're the way you reach conclusions. They're the best stepping stones you've got to get to something like truth or probability. Let's not use the word certainty. And postmodernism has relativized that to the point where almost no conclusion is non-negotiable. Is that the problem with postmodernism?
Right. I mean, that's a very stark way of putting it. It strikes me that sort of the old-fashioned science worship, fact worship, has been criticized by progressives and feminists and others, quite rightly. And some of them have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, as far as I can see, and some of them haven't. They've just pointed out, when in a way is obvious, that what our conception of as what constitutes a true claim at this point, obviously, I mean, this is the basis of science, right, can be altered by realizing that there are missing perspectives that have not been incorporated in it, and that we can see, science develops, new states of affairs come to light. Medicine is obviously a good place to look here. What was thought true or what was thought an effective therapy 20 years ago, it may now be seen in the light of further evidence to not work very well at all, and there are better therapies out there. But the underlying claim is that we're working toward an understanding of how the world really is, even if we're falsely assuming that we already have it. And it seems to me, so it's not a dichotomy between truth with a capital T, I don't even know what that means, and some view where we're just floating around in a morass that with no kind of ability to make assumptions about how the world is.
I used the word truth, and I guess I was thinking of the Stangram-Benson book on why truth matters, and I think that's probably truth with a capital T that might be convertible with relative certainty or validity or something like that.
It's on my reading list. I haven't read it yet.
It's a nice little book. I highly recommend it, but I'm not quite all the way through either. I'm asked to ask, so I'm asking, whether you could comment on the future of naturalism, since the title of this conference is that. And I suppose the implication, the thought behind that question has something to do with whether new theories and approaches in the sciences or social sciences might make naturalism a less significant philosophy in the future than it is today.
Maybe that depends on what you mean by naturalism.
Right.
I mean, I guess I have a pretty fluid conception of it, such that it can incorporate a lot in the way of new developments, better theories, better methods. So intellectually, it seems to me it's got to be bright because it's the only show in town. Politically, I have to say I'm pretty depressed about the future of naturalism.
Why don't you go on about that? Because I know you do a lot of thinking and writing and discussion in the field of politics and public policy and that sort of thing. I mean, how does philosophical thinking, and you don't need to address naturalism as such in this question, but how does philosophical thinking help us to think about public affairs and public policy?
I wish it helped me more. it's difficult to escape the conclusion that philosophy and philosophical thinking and argumentation isn't playing a very large role in the contemporary world. We could start with our leader. But the reality, I mean, I guess what depresses me still more, I mean, the U.S. has a unique and interesting history that I'm not an expert on, as you know, but in terms of religion, in the sense that it's always been a very religious country, I guess in part because of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment in particular. But I have to say that as a philosopher, what's depressing me more than anything is to look at the rest of the world, parts of which I had thought were really solidly secular, like Europe. Yeah. And the recent developments in Turkey, for example, just, not to mention, after the tsunami, apparently Aceh province, which used to be pretty solidly secular, basically religious opportunists said, this is because, you're also wicked, and now it's becoming apparently extremely religious. So I guess thinking about the last talk that we heard, I'm thinking more and more that we really do need to learn more about what flips people over, who seem to be, maybe not philosophers, but at least solidly secular for some reasons, apparently, into that other mode of just swallowing claims that, can't really be justified for emotional reasons, as far as I can see.
Why do you think it is that when people think about solutions to incidents of religious extremism, and we'll sort of avoid the word terrorism, which has a more specific connotation, that often people who aren't philosophically trained would say it's not about not knowing philosophy, it's not about not knowing logic, or it's not about not thinking straight. It's just bad religion or aberrant religion. And the solution is, as the solution to bad water might be good water or pure water, the solution would be pure religion or better religion, as opposed to something that seems to fall outside the domain of religion.
Well, not being a fan of religion, partly for epistemological reasons and partly historical reasons, given things like the Inquisition and so on.
Oh, that.
I guess I have a little trouble. Good religion is religion that, according to my lights, adopts the same principles on the basis of religious authority that I accept as being independently justifiable. So, but that's me. And that's obviously not going to be a standard for the rest of the world. I don't know what good religion is.
A naturalist, because I know that you're very, very good at argumentation based on spotting fallacies. I've had discussions with you in which I have been indicted for that very reason. But is every appeal to religious authority off limits within the naturalistic worldview? And is every appeal to religious authority, if I'm remembering Logic 101, sort of not one before the Blitz, and argumentum ad baculum, is that the one? Is it always an argument to the club of authority, to something that can punish you if you don't do what you're told, in other words?
Well, in some societies it clearly is. I don't think it is in our society quite yet, but it certainly constitutes an appeal to authority and an illicit appeal to authority. Who could be an authority on a system which seems to be, frankly, sort of created out of people's imagination, with other people propagating it and claiming to be experts on it and having the right to tell me what to think or how to act.
But you're also a very good teacher. You don't just write, think, and discuss. You also have to deal with students coming into a philosophy class for the first time who might say to you, I don't understand what the ultimate source or even an immediate source of authority might be in the absence of an absolute authority like God or what my religious tradition tells me to do. And what do you say to those people, to the naive? Because most people out there, let's face it, in America, on the street and in the supermarket, are pretty naive about this kind of thing.
Well, I think I would say that we're not really looking for an authority. We're looking for authoritative arguments, if you want to put it in those terms. But I wouldn't, that wouldn't come naturally to me. What I'd say is what we're looking for claims for which we can produce evidence that's publicly available, that doesn't depend on special insight. The difference is people who haven't been through certain courses might not be able to understand certain kinds of arguments. But the principle is that if you have been through those courses, you've been exposed to the material, you've learned how to, read certain kinds of things, learned certain kinds of things, that becomes you makes you capable of understanding the appeal of a position. And that's very different from somebody saying to you, well, the Catholic Church has always been against birth control.
Right.
I mean, the right question there is, well, why? And you expect to have some kind of argumentation better than Humanae Vitae.
Better than Humanae Vitae, the word of the Pope, the dogma of the Church, or the Bible.
And terrible consequentialist arguments. I mean, the arguments are based on, clearly the underlying assumption is that men want sex, women only want sex to have babies, and so if you have contraception, women lose their only barrier to these men running their lives and running amok. What kind of assumptions are those?
Those Catholic theologians, and I could name a few Catholic ethicists if that's not a complete oxymoron, who argue, for example, in favor of Catholic contraception, which is endorsed, the rhythm method. And there are so many jokes about the rhythm method I won't even start. But you don't see that as having a basis in what's sometimes called natural law. There's no equation here between natural law and philosophical naturalism. For the benefit of the viewers who might want to make that distinction, perhaps you should make it. How is natural law philosophy or natural law theology different from what we're calling philosophical naturalism?
Well, natural law, sort of bare bones claim is that values are written into nature, they're in nature, to be found by reason. But ultimately it must rest on the fact that God made the world and put those values there, because otherwise in a naturalistic world, how could that happen? It raises a lot of questions.
So it spins off of the design idea.
Right, I think so.
Somehow invest the world with meaning and purpose and law, and therefore becomes a sort of proof of his existence.
I suppose ultimately, and with respect to contraception, if there is an infertile period, then obviously God must have put it there via natural law, so it's okay to use it. But, sort of philosophical approach to that is, you say it's wrong to have sex with the intention of not having babies, but that's exactly what you're doing. So the motive is the same as using contraception. The only difference is you're using a device rather than a natural propensity, as the Catholics would put it.
Right.
Unless you're going to say there's something intrinsically wrong with these devices, which clearly is implied by the Catholic position, but it's hard to see where that comes from. And that's how you get the Pope saying it's wrong for homosexual males to use condoms to prevent AIDS.
Okay, very good. Well, that's food for thought, and I thank you for your very lucid answers to some pretty complicated questions, and as you say, sub-questions in addition to that. Thank you, Laura.